A blessed day. I am Edwin Valles, your host for Be Not Afraid, a podcast where we listen to stories of LGBT persons journeying through their Catholic faith. We are blessed again. We have another wonderful guest in this podcast, but this time we will listen to the story of a brother from another country. No? So we have with us today Brother Hudson Byblow from our brother in the church in Canada. Brother Hudson, kindly greet our podcast viewers.
Thanks for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, so Hudson and I belong to the Courage Apostolate. So he's a brother from Courage Canada. So yeah, I think a lot of people are interested back here in the Philippines on maybe how is the Catholic Church doing in Canada. So yeah, maybe care to share about it.
Sure. There's a lot that could be said, I guess. So in such a small, I'll try to focus on maybe that the area of the experience of going through courage and just navigating my way home into the Catholic faith. As a person, someone might describe as an LGBTQ Catholic, or what I like to describe as a personhood first, person who experiences or who has experienced particular attractions in his history. And so my favorite thing, Edwin, my favorite thing is to remember that the whole world says that I shouldn't be Catholic because the church hates LGBTQ people. And it's like everything that I've come to learn about the church and the beauty and the sacraments and entering into a deeper relationship with Jesus has shown me that the church is actually the greatest secret ever kept. It is the most beautiful encounter after encounter with the Lord. It's not without challenges, of course, because the Lord transforms our hearts. And when our hearts are transformed, you know what that means? It makes us look inside our hearts and ask, why do I want these things the way I do? Why do I experience attachment to these things the way I do? And where is Jesus in my life? Is he kind of on the side, or am I convincing myself that he's in the center, or is he really there? And am I willing to trust Jesus enough and the teachings of the church to surrender my heart to the church and to trust the church? Trust was a big one for me, a big issue, because part of my story, I was actually molested by a man. And when that happens, I don't wish that upon anyone, but it really accelerated mistrust in my life.
Yes.
And I had to really make sense of myself and actually navigating that wound and the healing from that wound, and learning that Jesus was going to receive me right where I was, even amidst shame that I had. I felt ashamed. I wasn't a little boy when it happened, but I was a little older, but I felt ashamed that I let that happen somehow. And Jesus just received me right where I was at. You brought up courage right away. I got to tell you, I think it was my first or second courage conference. And I remember sitting in the pew at the back, of course, because how could I ever bring myself to Jesus at the front? This was during adoration. And it was 3 in the morning, 3 or 4 in the morning, because of all night adoration. And I remember there was a girl across the aisle in adoration, and there was a beautiful glow about her. There was a very nice glow. And I in that moment, I realized that Jesus wasn't just reserved on that altar in the monstrance. He wasn't just up there far, far away from me. He actually comes to us. And that was the first time right then. It was right after that I said, Jesus, I surrender my heart to you. Please come into my heart. I invited him in for the first time, and he totally filled my heart like nothing I'd ever experienced before. And it just that was just early on in my journey of learning to trust again, learning to get to know the Lord Jesus, and to realize that, wait a second, I belong here. I belong in the Catholic Church, the church that the world says I shouldn't be in, but I belong here. And not only that, Jesus's love is for me, and his love is so much that if I really become present in the moment and just bask in his love, I will come out a transformed person every time, a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. And my heart was becoming healed of trust wounds, healed of relational wounds, healed from feeling unchosen. Like Jesus chose to come to me. Oh man, all these beautiful things, and all these things that addressed the the trajectory of my life, why I was making choices the way I was, largely to do with fear. So many of those things were healed gradually through those types of encounters with God. So yeah, that's the short story. I mean, like, maybe I'll tell some background about myself. Like, so yeah, growing up, I remember experiencing same-sex attractions and what today would be called transgender inclinations, and dreaming that I would be a girl, hoping that I could be a girl. I'd wake up the next day and I'd be a girl, and a lot of that, the Lord gave me some insight after prayer and stuff, and talking about how a lot of that was to do with the formation of my self-concept, and that was impacted on how I perceived myself to fit in the dynamics of my family and my community and stuff like that. I still have to this very day, a very loving family, and I don't blame any of my family. I love my family. I love my parents, and I know they love me. But one of the things is that I for one reason or another, I had an overly, like I said, unhealthy over attachment to my brother. Let's say he's an older brother. Let's say it was to the point of idolizing him. When I was little, I idolized him. And when we played together, of course, he always won the game, right? Because he was stronger than me, and I was 3 years younger and tinier. And so I just loved playing with him because it filled my heart, right, with joy. But I learned from that experience that first place, it wasn't where I belonged. I learned that I wasn't good enough I eventually began to take on thoughts that I wasn't good enough at doing boy things, because when we played together, we did boy things and I never won, right? And so eventually that just kind of wore on me, even though I was joyful in playing with him and I just accepted second place. I began to wonder, like, I'm not good at boy things. And then as nobody loves to fail over and over again. So I remember kind of like being okay with gravitating away from boyish things because they just kind of re-aggravated the feeling of not being good enough. This is just one angle. There's many angles.
Okay.
And yeah, I would, over time, because I moved away from those sorts of things, I didn't gain that confidence in the ways of boy, And so when it came time to, like, let's say, bond healthily with classmates, I saw them as being higher than me too. Like, I was idolizing them too. I thought they were so much better than me. And so there was this chasm between them and me. There's this gap between them and me, and they were higher up in my mind. And again, it's not my brother's fault. It's not my parents' fault. It's just how things went. But anyway, over time, I remember like wondering, like, do I fit in with them? Do I measure up? I always felt like they were here and I was on the outside trying to fit in, And yeah, I remember as time went on that gap kind of got larger and larger between us. And because I pushed myself away from the boys, even though I did have a few good friends, I did. But I pushed myself away from the boys overall, mentally. And what that did is further prevented me from understanding the ways of boys. So it got me further and further feeling like less good, I was less experienced in knowing how to be a young man, And so that wasn't good. But it was also accelerated by when I was 9 years old, my best friend moved away suddenly. I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. Now, him and me, we would play together every day. I mean, it was the best. You know, when you're a child and your heart is just so full of joy because you have a best friend. I don't know. Lots of people don't know what that feels like, but I did have the blessing of being able to know that. And but it was just boom overnight. They moved, and all I had was a little answering machine message back in the days before voicemail or before cell phones. And that's it. And so I remember crying. The trauma of loss, losing your best friend.
Yes.
And yeah, trauma of loss is big, and not
Or
having
abandonment, no? So yeah. So first is with your brother is insecurity. The second is abandonment. Sure.
yeah. And I know it wasn't their fault, but I didn't have the tools to
To
address.
cope, yeah, to understand. Yeah, sure.
Right. Yeah. And so I was just and so what I did is I turned inwards because I didn't want, like, I mean, I cried for 3 days, you know, like big. Um, I didn't want to ever feel that heartbreak again. And when a best friend moves away, there's heartbreak. It's okay to say there's heartbreak.
Sure. Yes.
And I didn't want to feel that ever again. And so it drew me to keep the boys at a distance. It would contribute to that gap between them and me because it's like I wanted to belong, but at the same time, I was terrified of belonging because I didn't want to be hurt, you know? And also I didn't want them to realize that if I saw them as higher, I didn't want them to realize that I was lower, right?
Correct.
If I kept distance, then they wouldn't really exactly know who I was, right? You know what else happened at the same age 9, is when I got exposed to pornography. And that made me turn inwards as I was trying to re-experience the first high. This wasn't something in the house or anything. It was just a television show after school. There was a little clip, a little 5-second clip, and that was enough to blow my mind. And but I began to, without understanding my body, I began to try to re-experience that high, getting high from that. And I began to feel ashamed for doing that, not because someone told me to feel ashamed, but because I just knew that I was
Instinctively, so deep inside.
yeah, I was escaping into fantasy and I was using people at the same time. That's how it eventually manifested. Because, you know, I'd look for the same kind of images, and I knew I was dealing with people without healthy relationship there. I didn't have those words at the time, but I knew I was using people, right, in doing that. And so the shame of that, so you add, you know, insecurity, you add, you know, the
abandonment, and then the shame. No? So and then eventually you mentioned earlier that you were also sexually molested. No? So but how does the, so with all these negative experiences, how did the church what was the role of the church during that time? You mentioned earlier that you're a convert. Is that correct?
No, I'm a revert.
Revert. Like okay.
Raised Catholic. Yeah, no, this is great. I was raised Catholic, and so all this time, like, every kid only lives the only life they know. So I went to church with Dad. I just did the thing on the day-to-day, and so I had an exposure to Jesus, and the love of Christ in our family unit was beautiful. But as time went on in the world, you know, more and more anxieties of the world creep into the hearts of those who are coming of age. I wasn't really coming of age with a desire to enter into the church. I was coming of age with a desire to be accepted by my peers. That was big. Yeah. And so the short story, that pornography went crazy, the molestation and escaping. And then down the right, online pornography came. And then that's where the exploring same-sex pornography started, which is very, very humbling. I looked at it. I remember looking at it because I was like, I just want to know if I'm gay. Because if I look at this and I like it, then I'll know that. Then I'll just know where I stand in the world. I know that I like that. But I was terrified. I didn't want to like it. But I found when I looked at it, I couldn't look away. But it wasn't like I enjoyed it. It was kind of like when you're watching a disaster on the TV, you know, a landslide or an explosion, you can't look away but you're not happy you're watching it. You're not, it's not a good thing. And a train falling off a cliff. So I just kind of wrestled with that, and I didn't want it. But so here's what happened. So I ended up moving up north to start my jobs and stuff like that. And I had been kind of out of the church for a few years, mostly because of a working schedule that kept me out of church. I didn't know there was daily mass. Anyway, but short story is I went from college and all that affirmation stuff up north, and there I met actual practicing Catholic people who were living a life of holiness, and they had peace. And the short story is that they had peace in their hearts that I really desired. I did not have peace in my heart, but these guys had peace, and it was such a beautiful and attractive peace. I just had to listen to them. I had to be around them. And they showed me about prayer again. We went to church. There was some kind of weekend retreat that we went to where people began to share their stories. And at that retreat, someone else shared something. And then I stood up and shared something tiny. I don't remember what it was, but it was the very first time I ever publicly spoke of some little thing that was hurting in my heart that I knew I needed the love of Jesus to heal. And this is so important because sharing brings about further sharing. So someone else was courageous enough to share, and that gave me the courage to share, which is why I'll spend the time trying to share stories now, right? Hopefully someone encouraged. But yeah, it was this peace. It was the peace that these people had, and I wanted it. And through them, I became re-exposed to the sacramental life, living in the faith in Mass. And that's where the joy began to flood back into my heart. And that's where, that was just before going to that Courage conference where Jesus came to me from the monstrance. It was slow, but God took his time with me. He just revealed things to me in a gentle way, in a way that I could handle. And I'm just grateful, so grateful.
Yeah. So what Hudson was referring to. So in the Courage conference, so there's an international conference, so once a year. In fact, it just recently happened. So mid-July in the US for 2021. But there's part of the program known as Eucharistic Vigil. So all the Courage members are encouraged to spend an hour with the Lord all through the night. So I think Hudson chose at 3 a.m. slot. When I did it, I chose maybe 5 a.m. just before the mass. So I could go to see. But it's a very deeply spiritual experience. What I liked about it in the conference I attended was the confession before. So it's like all the priest chaplains are there and all the members confessing, and then there was a healing service, and then the Eucharistic adoration followed. So yeah, so it's really a good experience so far. So, but then as far going back to Hudson, so his experience with the Catholic faith was reignited with witnessing. So because of his colleagues who were powerful witnesses of peace, so ambassadors of peace. And second, through communion, so that sense of safe space that he can openly talk about his pain and also listen to the pain of others. So, yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So in the Philippines, generally, I guess people tend to be more. They tend to go to practice their faith, I guess, more frequently because it's ingrained in the culture to go to mass every Sunday. Having said that, of course, I mean the mass turnaround is really not a lot. So it's maybe about 10 to 20% of the Filipino Catholics. But so we tend to be more on the pious side that way. So, but there are people who also go through that phase of questioning, of leaving the church and then going back to the church. So, but in the picture in my background, so there's the boat. So this is the story of Jesus Christ walking on the water, and the disciples were in the boat. So I think in several church documents, the church is also described as a boat. So exactly, and the church is living in turbulent times. So just like the picture. So that was the context of the gospel story. But I think we will dedicate more time on that in the next part of this episode. So we would like to understand what's the boat that is at the church in Canada, and was like the tempest that they're in, because for sure the Philippines also has its own version of a storm. So, but maybe in Hudson's sharing of what's happening in the church in Canada, we will also hopefully give insights on how to handle our own storms. So until then, so that ends the first part of our interview with Hudson. So I hope that you'll also join us in the second part of this interview, where we will talk about his experience as an LGBT person, Catholic LGBT person in Canada, and being belonging to the church in Canada. So until then, this is your host, Edwin Valles, and whatever the storms that we're facing, I hope and pray that all of us will lovingly hear in our hearts the assuring words of Jesus Christ. It is I, do not